does come down to the three candidates that I expect it to come down to, you know that this election is not about me. I would even go so far as to assert it's not really about you, but it is in some sense about, collectively speaking, it is about us. It is about us as Americans. It is about us in particular. If you think about the people that we represent, the people about whom we care, people that we call brothers and sisters for no other good reason than they are fellow Americans. And that includes a lot of people who among us are the least able to withstand the effects of bad public policy, least able to impose their values on our government, least able to assure that they're going to be represented. And as I mentioned, most vulnerable to bad public policy. I often talk about what it's like to be a police officer now because I feel that people express weird curiosity, especially if you're a libertarian, right? The one thing that I would share is that if you were not an economist, as I was professional, if you were not an economist before becoming a cop will turn you into an economist because you see the effects of bad public policy up close and personal. You see how it destroys individuals' lives and entire communities. Indeed, I would argue in some cases it's the root cause of intergenerational poverty that is so persistent, so many in particular, although not exclusively, in our urban areas. It is the result of bad public policy. Persistent intergenerational poverty is not something that would be predicted by free markets. It is something that comes up because we do things badly in all too many cases. And by we, I mean our representatives as a part of the government. In this sense, while the election may not be about certain people in the main who are sitting in this room, it is important. I would go so far as to argue that it's more important than the people sitting in this room. We all recognize that we have a big opportunity in 2024, and that's for a number of reasons with which we're all familiar. The Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Democratic leadership, they both have left behind the agenda that they have pursued in the past, and now find it. Nothing is more interesting than beating up on each other, right? The Democrats' number one policy agenda is to keep the Republicans out of power, and vice versa. And this is where authoritarianism comes from in democracy. It comes from someone convincing you that what's really important is not pursuing peace and public policy. What's really important is keeping that other idiot out of power. And so what you should be willing to do, of course, is compromise your civil liberties in order to keep me, a politician, in power. That's where authoritarianism comes from. It used to be the kind of thing that we would make fun of in the United States because it couldn't possibly happen here. It's not that funny anymore. Our government has gone off the rails, and I would argue that it's accelerating in the wrong direction. The good news, having said all that, because I think we all agree about the reasons why we have a big opportunity in 2024 is because a lot of bad things happen. The good news is that I think that more Americans than ever before are recognizing that a lot of our problems are the result of bad public policy. And that more Americans than ever before are recognizing that that public policy comes from politicians manipulating us, manipulating fear, manipulating the process, not being open to new ideas, and pursuing bad ideas over and over. I'm pretty sure that I was teasing you earlier about having given this talk for 12 minutes to people in the wrong venue half an hour ago. But I'm pretty sure I probably could have given the same talk and they would have been receptive to it. Because I think that people increasingly are recognizing that a lot of our problems are bad public policy. You don't have to be a libertarian these days to hate the government. Right. It used to be you had to be a libertarian to hate the government. But now I think that everyone is coming around for it. Which of course is why people like RFK Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy are making a little bit of ground inside their parties. They are not libertarians, but they are getting a little bit of ground just by being anti-government. To me, being anti-government is a piece of the puzzle, but it takes a lot more than that. It takes a thoughtful approach to principles, right? You can't just be anti-government because you're grumpy, which is the way RFK comes across sometimes. Or Vivek Ramaswamy, I don't like the government until I come up with the idea that I want to invade Mexico to support the war on drugs. That's a little weird, but at least we know that he's not a libertarian, right? He just thinks it's a fun idea to capture the mood of the Republicans, say, and the FBI. He's not really sure why, but that's okay, right? So I think that we all recognize that we have an opportunity, but because there's so much at stake, I want to argue that it's not just an opportunity, but it's an obligation to get a few things right. In this sense, this is the reason why I'm in the campaign. It's the reason why I built a team. It's the reason why people like Irene are on the team as well. It's because we have an obligation to get this right. We have missed the opportunity in the past by doing a few things that I would argue were done wrong. And this is where I need to add, because I have failed to do so in the past, I need to add immediately, this is not personal. The people that have represented our party in the past are lovely. I'm a bit of a fan of Jo Jorgensen. I think she's terrific. She's been nice to me. The fact that she ran a campaign that I don't think well represented our principles is not a personal matter. I think it was just a missed opportunity. I would say the same thing about Gary Johnson. Seems like a nice guy. I don't know him. Seems like, for the most part, a libertarian fellow. I understand that he did a nice job as governor of New Mexico, so I'm not suggesting that any of this is personal. He just missed the opportunity to run a decent campaign, and so when he forgot to name the town in Syria, the whole thing imploded because he had not given the American public a reason to hang on to him. Contrast that with Donald Trump, who famously said, I think I could go out to Fifth Avenue and shoot someone without listening to votes. I'm not suggesting that we need to run a campaign like Donald Trump's. But you have to admit that the guy was probably right. As weird a statement as that is, he was probably right. People know why they hate Donald Trump. You and I know why we don't like Donald Trump. People know why they like Donald Trump. Not so with Gary Johnson. If you're out there suggesting you need to support me because I'm fiscally conservative like a Republican and socially liberal like a Democrat, you have not given people a reason to hang on to you. This is a mistake of marketing 101 proportions, right? You would not expect to get an A in your first marketing class if you had defined yourself in the context of your competition, particularly in a political context. Particularly if you're trying to take on the duopoly and give people a third option. The reason we're here is to give people a different look. We would argue it's not a third option, it's a second option, because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have given up on their previous agenda and merged into one big block, right? Very pro-government, very pro-spending, very pro-war. We're trying to give people a different look. To be successful, I believe that we need to cleave a very hard edge against Republicans and a very hard edge against Democrats. If you hear of anyone defining our campaign as being somehow similar in certain contexts to a Republican or Democrat, we are miscommunicating. Our job is not to find overlap with those politicians. Our job is to find common ground with their voters, not with their politicians. We need to differentiate ourselves completely. In that sense, I think that we've missed opportunities in the past. One of the reasons why we're running the style of campaign that we are is because we do believe that we need to lead with a principled campaign of the most transformational ideas, which is why we do this Bold New Deal, right? I know everyone has spent lots of hours on boldnewdeal.org memorizing our platform. So I won't have to go into that in great detail today. But it is full of the types of ideas that we like to lead with as libertarians, right? Decentralization and limiting power and getting rid of certain agencies because the relationship between us and the federal government is wholly inappropriate and abusive. We're all on the same page there. But going out on the balcony and screaming, "End the Fed," as I so often do, doesn't get you a lot of traction if you can't back it up. In this sense, being an economist, for better or for worse, I'm not even suggesting that's necessarily a good thing, but it is the thing I happen to find myself in. If you're a professional economist and you're in the Libertarian Party, I think you're obliged to put together a credible campaign and lead the charge on any Fed first. For this reason, we built a very, very professional campaign. We have 15 people on the team that we pay, very little, just in case that doesn't get edited out for Irene's sake. She might argue, we do. Yes, you get paid, it's just not a great deal. And then we have another dozen people in an advisory capacity who we don't pay. They boss us around as though they do, right? And then we have volunteers on top of it. So altogether, there's a fairly big team. But we believe that approaching this in the most professional manner is critical, not only because of the task ahead of us, but because we are leading with the most principled ideas. In other words, because we're going out there with such transformational ideas, it's doubly important to run as professional a campaign as possible. Because otherwise you run the risk of being immediately dismissed because your ideas are so edgy and unfamiliar to so many people in, for example, the mainstream. So you have to be able to run with a great deal of credibility in terms of background, but also in terms of your team and the kind of campaign that you put out there. So that's why we've done all the things that we have done in order to build the type of campaign that we are building. It's a little bit expensive, but we do think that this is an obligation. If we don't get this right, I fear that we are quickly approaching, nobody knows exactly when, but I fear that we are approaching in some sense a point of no return. For example, well before the end of this century, the federal government will go bankrupt. I don't think there's a lot of counter-argument to that at this point. I don't know exactly when, and I don't know exactly what that would look like. But my greatest fear is not the fiscal insolvency of the U.S. federal government per se. My greatest fear is that by the time that happens, people like us won't give a damn. Because we will have stopped looking for any value whatsoever in the federal government, right? And we will have come to the conclusion that not only on balance is the net negative, I think most of us have probably crossed over into that territory already, that on balance it's a net negative. But worse, it's not adding any value at all. Like there's almost no value it's creating to offset the mess that it creates. It's still a family business here, so I need to watch myself carefully. However you feel about national defense, right? If you want to claim that there's some benefit to our federal government providing national defense, surely it is swamped by the negative aspects that our federal government imposes on the rest of us, the rest of the days, and the rest of the months, and the rest of the years. I would also argue the American public is ready to hear an anti-war message. And so I think the American public is ready to hear a brand new approach to foreign policy. In that sense, I think that everyone is ready for the federal government to go out of business at some point. And so my fear is not the fiscal insolvency itself, but that people will say, good riddance. And so I think that this is, for example, I do believe that this is our last opportunity to save what I think is an important institution. Not because the federal government has done a good job, not because I expect it to do a good job, because I fear what will replace it. I don't anticipate that the federal government going out of business will be an orderly transition. And so I worry about that. I think that the best approach for us now, in 2024 land, right, at the moment, is to try to save it from the jaws of defeat, to try to save it from the Republican and Democratic model. Try to save it in a fiscal sense, and try to save it in a constitutional sense. If we're waiting for anyone else to lead the charge back toward the Constitution, I believe that we're waiting for something that's not going to happen. There's no such thing as a group of Republicans out there who's going to lead that charge, and similarly, there certainly is no such thing as a group of Democrats that are going to lead that charge. It's up to us. And if we miss the opportunity, if we miss the obligation, I do fear that we will quickly reach that point of no return, and we're looking at a fiscal insolvency that we won't really care about in the fiscal sense because it will be an authoritarian catastrophe that we'll be happy to wave to as it goes off over the horizon. And I fear what happens in a disorderly resolution of the fight. That's why I think this is not because of a deep-seated affection for the federal government, but a recognition that we don't know what it looks like when it goes or goes over. Does that make sense so far? What is on your minds? Well, let's hear them in pairs. We're not going to impose the OQO, question only. You can ask anything you want.
Okay.
Sometimes we get state conventions, I like to impose the OQO, not questions only. But you can ask them, you seem like a relatively normal person. Relatively. Yeah, we're not setting the bar too high here, by the way. Yeah, that's not a huge claim.
So, recently the Mises Caucus, Indian have you been in contact with anyone in power in the Mises Caucus, and do you think they will endorse multiple candidates, or are you worried that you're going to try to remove the other guy?
The answers are yes, no, and yes. Yes, I've been in contact. No, I don't think that they will have an official endorsement. Yes, I think that they will support Rector Wall. Particularly, no, I'm not worried about it. Does that make any sense? The reason I'm not worried about it is complex. And I don't want to say anything either untoward or unkind. But I think I can best summarize by just saying, no, I'm not worried. I could imagine situations in which I were worried, so I'm not blowing off your question.
Yeah.
I think it's a reasonable question. I can easily imagine situations in which I were worried. That's just not one of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I can maybe expand it.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't really want to expand on video, so I'm just going to leave it at that.
Let's hit a button. Irene.